I'll talk about specifics to do with the budget and things I'd like to see added in a moment, but I'd like an opportunity to just take a look back at Budget 2015 and to see does it stack up against various values that I and other members of Dáil Éireann and across the parties would hold dear. Budget 2015 is regressive. The combination of water charges and income tax changes means that this budget will take money from lower income households and give it to higher income households. And this is not my opinion, this is a mathematical certainty. Now, in the last previous budgets, Labour and Fine Gael have introduced regressive budgets. We have ESRI analysis to that effect. In other words, the government has asked those who have the least to contribute the most, but at least it asked everyone to contribute. This is the first year that the government has introduced a budget which takes cash out of lower income households and puts that cash into higher income households. Now, in real terms, what that means is that people on, let's say, minimum wage will have money taken off them by this budget and given to people like us on higher wages. That, to me, does not seem like a reasonable or proper thing to do. Budget 2015 is fiscally irresponsible. I think one of the things this government could take credit for until now was making hard choices and bringing the deficit down. I don't agree with a lot of those choices, but it certainly could stand over hitting and exceeding the targets that were set. The Troika is not out of the country a wet week. In the April Stability Programme update, the government identified a target of €2 billion of deficit reduction measures. Just 9 months later, even less than 9 months later, in what may be a pre-election budget, the government has reversed engines by €3 billion. This is not a marginal change. The government has given it the full Bertie. However, it looks like the Irish people may have changed. In spite of this largesse before an election, or potentially before an election, the satisfaction ratings in the polls for the government continue to drop. So maybe the public have decided that this Fianna Fáil style of politics should no longer be tolerated. Budget 2015 wastes public money. I want to take a very clear example. I want to take healthcare. This year, the healthcare spend will overrun by about €500 million. Now, the government could have looked at healthcare, some parts of which are run very well, some parts of which are run extremely badly, and it could have said, we're going to get better at procurement. I identified how about €1.1 billion could be saved over ramping up over several years by forming a joint venture with the NHS and mandating generics, as they did in England and as they did in Wales. But instead of doing this, instead of looking at the operation of the HSE and saying, you know what, we can run our hospitals better than this, we can do preventative care better than this, we can buy drugs and equipment and devices better than this, what the government has done is said, look, you overran by 500 million last year, or this year, so you can have an additional 500 million next year. That is not a responsible handling of public money, in my opinion. Arguably, the single biggest failure of Budget 2015 for me is the failure to invest in education. Now, the total increase in spending on education is €46 million. Current expenditure goes up by €60 million, and capital expenditure goes down by €14 million. So the net increase in funding to education between this year and next year, because of this budget, is €46 million. Now, that's less than 0.5% of the education budget, which, as we all know, is less than inflation. So in real terms, this budget represents a cut, yet again, to education in this country. That is a really, really dumb thing for us to do in this country. A school principal in Wicklow said to me recently that due to the cut in the capitation grant to his school, he'd run the numbers and he didn't think he was going to be able to keep the heat on all of the days that it needed to be on, and he asked me what he should do about that. So I submitted a parliamentary question to Minister O'Sullivan with the question and said, what should school principals do? You're cutting their capitation grant. They're not going to be able to, this principal has run the numbers and said that he is not going to be able to keep the heat on when he needs to. What should he do? What is your advice as Minister for Education? Here's the reply I got. Capitation funding provided for general running costs and funding provided for caretaking and secretarial services may be regarded as a common grant from which the Board of Management can allocate according to its own priorities. Let's just think about what we're saying to the schools. We're saying we're going to cut your capitation grant, and if you can't keep the heat on, take the money from somewhere else. But as we all know, because we're all trying to help schools in our constituencies, they don't have money anywhere else. So what are they going to do? They're going to have less chairs for the kids. They're going to have less tables for the kids. They're going to have less paper for the kids. We don't know. But that kind of a response between finance, public expenditure and education that says we're going to take money away, you're telling us you've got to turn the heat off, not our problem, that's your problem. That is not an acceptable way to govern in this country. Budget 2015 is nakedly political. We've heard much praise of the 11 measures which will return profits to people who own land. Now, I have no problem with them. I've looked at those measures. Some of them seem like very sensible measures. But it is interesting that Fine Gael, the Farmers' Party, has 11 measures that return profits to those who own land, and it doesn't have 11 measures, or 10, or 8, or 5 for any other sector of society. Budget 2015 attacks the self-employed, and this really is extraordinary. The government keeps talking about how important entrepreneurs are. We saw the Taoiseach obviously at the Web Summit. And yet the budget introduces a higher rate of tax for the self-employed. How extraordinary. Now, I've asked a few people why this might be the case. I've asked a few people who were involved in policy in the past, and they said, well, the feeling in the civil service and the feeling amongst the TDs, all of whom are on public sector pay and public sector pensions, the feeling is that self-employed people were able to reduce their tax exposure in various ways, and therefore you compensate by taxing them more. However, as we all know, the opportunities for self-employed people to reduce their taxation burden have pretty much been cut out over recent years, but the mindset's still there. So what are we saying? What we're saying to the Irish people is, enterprise is important. Entrepreneurship is really important. The Web Summit, fantastic. Listen, you go out there and you set up a business and you invest your money and you take the risk and you work hard. But by the way, we're going to tax you more than the politicians in Dáil Éireann and the civil servants who between them make up these rules, who are all sitting here safe. And if you fail, you won't get the same social protections that everybody else gets, but we support you. That is hypocrisy at its very worst, and it needs to stop. Finally, Budget 2015 is devoid of information we all need, and regardless of one's view on the budget, I hope every member of Dáil Éireann would agree that we have not been given sufficient information with which to interrogate it. That's our job. It's only Dáil Éireann that can vote through finance bills. And Dáil Éireann, we in Dáil Éireann, are constitutionally obliged to hold Cabinet to account. That's our job. Now, I and others have asked for years for a distributional analysis of the budget to be provided. Who is it taking from? Who were the winners and losers? When I asked then Taoiseach Eamon Gilmore for that, he accused me of being an opportunist. I asked Minister Howland recently enough in the Chamber if we could have it, and he said no, because it wouldn't be reasonable to assess crisis-era budgets in that way. And what a preposterous thing to say to the members of Dáil Éireann. There's a line item in the budget that applies 900 million to what's called demographic pressures. No idea what they are. It's not in any of the documentation. Hundreds of millions in additional expenditure has been granted to something called existing services. Again, absolutely nothing there. In the Finance Committee, about 36 hours ago, I asked Minister Noonan if we could have a reasoned document saying why Ireland should not sign up to the financial transaction tax. He may be right that we shouldn't do it. We don't know. And he said no. He said his job is to govern and make policy, and that was the end of that. And no, he was not minded to supplying Parliament or the Finance Committee with the rationale for why he's making important taxation decisions. Now, I'm out of time. I'll send on the proposals. I have a range of proposals which I would like the government to consider. There's a clause in the Constitution which, as we all know, has been interpreted such that no TD or senator can suggest any amendments to legislation that costs money or raises money. Now, in the context of the budget, we in Dáil Éireann not being able to propose anything that costs money or raises money means that we can't engage meaningfully at committee stage with the budget. So maybe when the government decides to have a referendum on the public ownership of Irish water, which I am currently submitting a piece of legislation on, we might also have a legislation that allows members of Dáil Éireann to do their job. Thank you very much.